She documented everything, every observation, every medication administered, every call bill response, every family interaction. She was thorough. She was experienced. She genuinely believed her notes were complete. And then 18 months later, she sat in a coronial inquest and the barrister stood up and read her progress notes aloud. Resident appears comfortable, ob stable, no concerns noted. The barrister looked up. You wrote these residents appeared comfortable? What does comfortable mean? She had no answer. Not because she didn't know her patient, but because her clinical reasoning, the assessment she had done, the concern she had felt, the decision she had made was not in the notes. Her notes were not wrong. They were not falsified. They were not incomplete in a way most nurses think of incomplete. They were undocumented clinical thinking. And in the legal review, in a coronial inquest, in an AHPRA investigation, in a civil claim, undocumented clinical thinking does not exist. This reflects a system of gap, not an individual failure. A gap between what nurses are taught to document and what medical legal review actually requires. Today on Clinical Insights, we're breaking this down. So, most nurses were trained to document what they did, tasks completed, observations recorded, care delivered, and that training produced exactly what you would expect. Yes, but here is the reframe I want you to hold for the rest of this video. A progress note is not a task log. It is a clinical record, and there is a profound difference between those two things. Now, task log, what you did. Clinical record, what you thought, found, and decided. The difference between the two, let's say a task log says 6 o'clock medication administered, obs taken, resident settled. That's it. But a clinical record says 6 o'clock medication administered as charted, obs BP 118/72, heart rate of 88, with a respiratory rate of 16, temperature is 37.1, SpO2 95 on room air, within normal limits for this resident alert and orientated, oral intake approximately, let's say 60% at breakfast, reduced from usual, no pain reported, family member, let's say son, contacted at 7:30, reduce appetite, plan, monitor fluid balance, will review at 12 o'clock. So both nurses documented one of those notes survives a colonial inquest. The other one, in a hearing room, becomes the question the barrister asks for 45 minutes. For registered nurses, and this is foundational, regardless of how many years you've been practicing, your notes are not a record of your shift. They are the written evidence of your clinical thinking. The documentation must show not just what you did, but what you assess, what you found, what you decided, and what you've communicated. For care managers like me at and team leaders, this is an education and supervision issue as much as it is an individual practice issue. If your team's documentation is constantly task based, that is a systemic training gap, and it carries systemic risk. In that inquest, wasn't asked about what she did. She was asked about what she thought, what she assessed, what she noticed, and her notes, full as they were, could not answer those questions. That is the documentation gap we are closing today. If you are working in clinical care, this applies to you. Now, let me show you why this matters at a system level. The expectation of clinical documentation in Australia are not vague. They are specific, published, and auditable. And the gap between what those standards require and what most nursing notes actually contain is significant. When APRA receives a notification about a nurse, whether an employer, a family member, or the coroner, the first document they request is the clinical record, not the policy manual, not the training records, the notes. And the question they are asking as they read is, does this documentation demonstrate the professional standards of a competent registered nurse? And then there is what happened in coroner's court. Coroners in Australia have reviewed nursing documentation on across thousands of cases, and the pattern they identify are consistent across multiple colonial findings. Reviewers notes the same gaps: absence of clinical reasoning, vague language that obscures clinical status, missing escalation documentation, and family communication that is referenced but not substantively recorded. Now, here is the legal and professional reality of clinical documentation. If your clinical reasoning is not in the note, it's not in a review, in a hearing, in an investigation, it does not exist. The note is the evidence. The note is what you are accountable to, not your memory, not your intention, not what you told the incoming nurse at the handover. The note. Um, that nurse in the inquest, her clinical reasoning existed in her head. She knew her patient. She had assessed her. She had a concern, but it was in her head, not in the note. And in the room where it mattered, a head is not admissible. A note is. Let's look at exactly this breaks down. Five specific documentation failures. So each one is a pattern. Each one appears in colonial findings, APRA review, outcomes, and civil claims. And each one has a direct practical fix. One, the language that loses cases. Now, let me read you a short list of words and phrases that appears in nursing notes every day in Australia. I've seen this because as a care manager, I've read this, and that have all been challenged with varying outcomes in legal and regulatory proceeding. Stable is one. Comfortable, settled, appears well. No concerns noted, resting quietly, tolerating care well. These praises feel like documentation. They feel complete. They convey a general sense that things were okay. But under cross-examination or under the coronial lens, every one of these phrases produces the same question. Compared to what? Stable means nothing unless you say stable compared to what? Stable from yesterday's blood pressure of 180? Stable compared to last week's deterioration. Let's say stable compared to baseline. Comfortable is a subjective term unless you record no verbal pain indicators, no facial grimacing, no guarding. Residents denied pain when asked. Pain score is 0 on Abbey scale. No concerns noted. Means what? I assess this person and found nothing of clinical significance. If you cannot justify that sentence with specific assessment findings, do not write it. For new graduates, and I want to direct about this, the habit of vague documentation is often taught inadvertently um, by watching experienced nurses who have never been challenged on their notes. That's how everyone writes. It's not it's not a defense. It is a description of a shared risk. Document what you specifically found, not what you generally felt. Number 2, missing clinical reasoning. Clinical reasoning, well, in plain terms, the thinking process that connects your assessment findings to your decisions. It is the most important thing about your clinical practice, and it is almost never documented. Most nurses complete a complex clinical assessment, make an informed professional judgment, decide to monitor, escalate, or intervene, and then write resident reviewed will continue to monitor. That note records a decision, it does not record a reasoning. And in a review, reasoning is everything. The NMBA standards for practice require that registered nurses demonstrate critical thinking and analysis. That standard is not just professional expectation, it is a documentation expectation. Your notes must show you um, that that you were thinking, not just doing. Notice what happened in that second set of notes. You can see exactly what the nurse found, what she thought, and what she decided. A reviewer reading those notes 6 months later in a different room can follow her reasoning from beginning to end. That is defensible documentation. That is what protects you. Now, third, missing escalation documentation. Of all the documentation failures I see in legal and regulatory review, because, this is one that produces the most devastating outcomes for nurses. They escalated, they genuinely escalated. They called the doctor, they told the team leader, they flagged the concern at handover, and then they documented nothing. And in the review, months or years later, when they say, but but I told someone, that record shows no evidence of it. And now it becomes your word against the absence of a note. Under the NSQHS Standard 6, the escalation process is not just a clinical action. It is a documented communication event. Who you escalated to, and what time, what information you conveyed, what response you received, and what action was taken. All of that belongs in the clinical record. In aged care, under the Serious Incident Response Scheme and Aged Care Quality Standards 3, which covers personal and clinical care, the expectation is equally explicit. If a deterioration concern was escalated internally or externally, the documentation must show it. And I want to add one more thing about this because it matters. When escalation is documented and the treating team or on-call doctor does not respond appropriately, that escalation record protects you. It shows you, yeah, you did your job. It shifts the accountability to where it belongs. And undocumented escalation protects no one. No one. Now, four, not documenting what you did. Now, this is common. Here is a documentation principle that most nurses learn late. if they learn it at all. Documenting what you did, what you did not find, is as important as documenting what you did. When a patient deteriorated and you had assessed them 2 hours earlier and found nothing clinically significant, your notes needs to show that assessment, not just reviewed. The specific systems you check, the specific findings that were normal, the specific parameters that were within baseline. Because in the absence of documented negative findings, in a review of a case where something went wrong, the question is not what you did what did you find. It is did you have a look. Now, a note that says reviewed, no comments, proves you were present. It does not prove you assess. A note that says respiratory assessment at, let's say, 2200, respiratory 16, SpO2 of 96 on room air, chest clear, bilaterally no distress, no use of accessory muscles, consistent with residents' usual baseline, proves you assess. That is the difference between a note that creates liability and a note that dissolves it. And five, undocumented family communication. The fifth failure is one that is deeply painful because the nurses involved in these cases were usually trying to be reassuring, trying to maintain a relationship with the family, doing what exactly good nurses do. They listened to the family, they responded, and then they didn't write it down in coronial findings, in aged care complaints, or in AHPRA notification. One of the most consistent pattern is a family member raised a concern. A nurse responded to that concern. The clinical record shows neither the concern nor the response. So, under the aged care quality standards, consumer experience, including family communication, it is a governance and clinical indicator. Under the NDIS practice standards, feedback from participants and their families must be documented in action. And also in acute settings, family communication is part of the clinical record under NSQS Standard 2, part, partnering with consumers for all settings. And this is the principle that matters most. When a family member tells you or tells you their loved one seems different, seems unwell, seems strange, that is a clinical cue. It must be documented as a clinical cue, not a social note, not a relationship entry, a clinical observation from someone who knows this person better than any nurse on shift. Now, I want to tell you about a composite case, a pattern I have seen reconstructed across multiple coronial and governance reviews. The person is fictional. The documentation failure is not. Now, Nurse C had been a registered nurse for 11 years. She worked night shift in, let's say, a residential aged care facility. She was known as conscientious. She was liked by residents and families. She was considered by her colleagues to be experienced and reliable. On a Wednesday night, she cared for a 79-year-old resident, Mr. K, who had a history of heart failure and was 4 days post urinary tract infection. His antibiotic has been completed 2 days earlier. During 2200 round, Nurse C noticed something she but she couldn't name it precisely. Well, he was awake when he should have been asleep. He was restless. He looked pale than usual. She took his observation. His blood pressure was 108 over 64, lower than his documented baseline of 130 over 140 systolic. His heart rate was 96. His temperature was 37.8. Each of those numbers individually was within limits. Together, in the context of a man 4 days post antibiotic, completion with a heart failure history, they told a different story. She made a clinical judgment. She decided to monitor and reassess at midnight. She told the oncoming nurse at Hanover, keep an eye on Mr. K. He seemed a bit off tonight. Her progress notes read, resident reviewed, I was taken resting comfortably, will monitor. At 3:40, the oncoming nurse found Mr. K unresponsive. He was transferred to hospital. He died the following evening. In the coronial inquest that followed, the reviewer reconstructed the night from the clinical record. The note from 2200 said, resting comfortably, will monitor. There was no documentation of the reduced blood pressure, no documentation of the palo, no documentation of the restlessness, no documentation of the clinical concern, no documentation that a decision was made to reassess at midnight or whether that reassessment ever occurred, and no documentation of the verbal handover instruction. Keep an eye on Mr. K. Nothing. Quietest moment of of um, of the night. So Narcy testified that she had noticed the change, that she had been concerned, that she had made a clinical decision. The coroner's finding was compassionate. It did not find her negligent, but it noted explicitly that the documentation did not reflect the clinical picture observed at 2200, and that if the documented concern had been escalated, a different outcome was possible. She knew her patient. She had a clinical instinct. She made a decision, and every single part of that, the assessment, the concern, the reasoning, the decision, was visible only to her, not to the next nurse, not to the treating team, not to the reviewer, not to Mr. K's family. This reflects pattern identified across multiple reviews. If a reviewer look at your last, let's say, 3 progress notes tonight, could they reconstruct your clinical thinking? Could they see what you found, what you decided, and why? Or, or would they see what you did or nothing more? So, to end this video, I've got this. Well, here's something practical you can use. Starting tomorrow. I call it CLEAR, CLEAR framework, and it is a clear 5-part structure for writing a progress note that is clinically honest, legally defensible, and professionally sound. One you can apply to any note, any setting, starting tonight. You do not need to write a novel. A clear note, CLEAR, a clear note for a routine assessment might be 4 to 6 lines. For a clinical concern, 8 to 12. What you are doing is ensuring that every note answers the 5 questions a reviewer will ask. And it will answers all 5. It is defensible, not because it is long, because it is complete. The CLEAR, CLEAR framework protects your patient by ensuring the next clinician has the information they need to continue safe care. It protects you by creating a written record of your clinical competence. And it protects your service by building a culture of documentation that reflects the standard of care being delivered, not a sanitized version of it. Now, there usually have, every time you write on the progress note, I always ask myself questions. So I've come up as a care manager before, I've come up with 5 questions um, every progress note must answer, and hence clear framework exists. Now, when documentation is vague, clinical risk increases, right? So a progress note is not just a record of what happened. It is the evidence of what you assess, what you change, and how you responded, and what the next clinician needs to do. That is why I use the CLEAR documentation framework. So CLEAR stands for clinical findings linked to baseline, escalation, assessment reasoning, and response and review plan. Now, let's break it down. Now, clinical findings. Well, first, we've got these clinical findings. So, document what you actually found, not stable. Instead, say BP 108 over 64, heart rate 96, respiratory rate, say 22, SpO2 93 on room air temperature is 37.8. Resident appeals drowsier than usual and required prompting to answer questions. Specific findings make your note defensible. The test is simple. Could a nurse who has never met this person understand exactly what you found? The 2 is letter L, linked to baseline. A number of its own is not enough. For one person, a systolic BP of 108 may be normal. For another person, it may be significant deterioration. So weak documentation says BP slightly low. Strong documentation says BP 108 over 64 below documented baseline of 130 over 40 systolic. That tells the reviewer why the finding matters. The test is, does this note show whether the person is better, worse, or unchanged compared to their usual baseline? The third one is E, escalation. If you escalated, document it clearly. Who did you escalate it to? What time? What did you report? What was the response? For example, at 1:35, concern escalated to on-call RN due to reduced level of alertness. BP below baseline and increased respiratory rate. RN advised repeat, say, observation in 30 minutes and to contact on the on-call GP if BP remains below 110 systolic or conscious state declines. If you choose not to escalate, document your clinical reason and review plan. The test is, if the outcome becomes adverse, would this note show that you acted on what you found? The fourth one is the assessment reasoning. So this is the why behind your decision, not just patient assess. Instead, findings indicate, say, a change from baseline with increased drowsiness and BP below usual range. Clinical concerns raised for possible early deterioration. This shows your clinical thinking. It shows that you did not just complete the task, you interpreted the findings. The test is, can a reviewer see not only what you did, but why you did it? The other one is response and review plan. So the response and review plan is what every progress note should make the next step clear. Not it's more more example is will monitor, you know. Instead, do it like will assess vital signs and level of consciousness at around 2 o'clock. If systolic BP remains below 110, respiratory rate increases above 24, or level of alertness declines, will contact on-call doctor immediately. That is the plan. It tells the next nurse what to watch for, when to review, and when to escalate. The test is if you handed over now and did not return, would the next nurse know exactly what to do? So before before you finish your next progress note, ask yourself 5 questions. C, what did I find? L, how does it compare to baseline? E, did I escalate or why did I not? A, what was my clinical reasoning? R, what is the review plan? That is the C.L.E.A.R, clear documentation framework. Clear notes protects residents. Clear notes support nurses. Clear notes strengthen clinical governance. I have to slow it down. And most importantly, clear notes help the next clinician act safely. In the inquest room, and the nurse in every documentation review I have seen was not a bad nurse. She was a nurse whose clinical competence was invisible. In her notes and in her legal or regulatory review, invincible is not safe. This is a systemic problem. Nursing documentation is still taught in many contexts as a task, you know, recording function. The expectation of clinical reasoning in written form, the requirement to make your thinking visible is not embedded early enough, clearly enough, or consequently or consistently enough in nursing education and supervision. That is a system gap, but it is not a reason to wait, because the nurse who signs the note is the nurse who stands in the hearing room, and no system gap stands beside you. At Clinical Insights with Ed, I believe that documentation is not administrative. How do you pronounce it? It is clinical. It is the most doable, most renewable, most consequential part of your professional practice. The note you write at 3 a.m. when you're tired and the ward is quiet, that is where your professional standards are tested, not in your performance review, not in your training records, in the note. Here are the concrete action I want every nurse and care manager to take before their next shift. Pull up the last progress notes you wrote. Read it as if you are a barrister who has never met this patient. Ask, does this note tell me what was found? Does it tell me what was decided and why? Does it show what was escalated and to whom? Does it shows the plan? If the answer to any of those questions is no, now you know where to start. If this gives you something, share it with your team, because somewhere tonight a nurse is writing, appears well, no concerns noted, and genuinely believing she has completed her documentation. This video might be the thing that changes what she writes tomorrow. Subscribe to Clinical Insights with Ed. Next week, we're going straight into the escalation conversation that nurses avoid, what to say exactly when you're concerned and the treating team isn't responding. The language, the documentation, and the professional obligations. That's next. And I want to leave you with a question, not for agreement, but for honest reflection. Read back your last progress note right now. Yes. Could a stranger reconstruct your clinical reasoning from it? Or just your task? Because in a review room, a stranger will try. Ahmed, this is clinical governance made real. See you next one.